things that we need to know for our lives. Help us to take these lessons to apply them to our lives, Father, and to go on in this. We thank you, Lord, for the many wonderful blessings you've given us in our lives. Most of all for your Son, who died on the cross for us. It's in his name we pray.
Amen. Thank you very much. So the very first thing we start off with, the words of Nehemiah, it gives us a little bit of information. It came to pass in the month of Chislev in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, some Bibles say Shushan, one of the capitals of the Persian Empire. So the first question we had here was, okay, so how much time has passed from the last things we read in the book of Ezra till now? And to be fair, it's not easy to put that together. But if you take the timing here where he gives us a time frame and we go what Ezra says, anybody do the math on that and look that up? What did you come up with? 18? 13 is what I came up with, yeah. So 13 years is what I came up with. So we have about a 13-year difference of time has passed now. Same king. Some interesting things, though, have gone on within that timing of some of the things that are going on in Jerusalem. And so we read about how it is that somebody comes to him, a man named Hanani, one of the brethren, comes from Judah. And so Nehemiah asks him about the Jews that are there. He says, I asked him concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived captivity, concerning Jerusalem. Verse 3, what is the report that he gives? What does he say about Jerusalem? It's in bad shape. Yeah, Jerusalem, you know, the way he describes it here in verse 3, the survivors that are there, they're in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, its gates are burned with fire. Now, we've made this point several times. Let's make it again. A city without walls is a city that's not going anywhere. It's not safe. It'd be like a city, you know, you think of the Old West, you watch the Western, where, you know, there's no sheriff in town and the bandits are in town and they run everything, you know, I was thinking we watched the movie Tombstone a few months ago, and I think of, you know, how wild a town like that was without law and order. That's kind of what we're talking about, except worse. Except the idea is that this, you know, the dangers that the people are in are much worse because, you know, they'll come in and just wipe out the town. People live in fear. What reproach? What's the reproach going on? It's kind of an interesting word to use here in the New King James Standard.
They've given the permission the first time to come back, and they said God's going to take care of it. And here they haven't done anything to show that your God's taking care of it. No, we're afraid.
Yeah. So Sandy's the word afraid. I like that. And reproach. Who is giving them reproach? Reproach kind of be like, you know, they're being humiliated, they're being taunted. A lot of different ways you can look at that. Who's doing it? Yeah, their neighbors. You know, it'll call them several times the enemies of Judah. So the people that are surrounding them are bringing reproach to them, and that's a big deal. You know, what's happening here is that the people are saying, yeah, I kind of think of it like this. They're saying, Nehemiah, I just don't think we're going to make it. You know, I just don't think, you know, after all this time, you know, we've had the 60, you know, here's our timetable. We've been talking about the 60 years. Add another 15 now, 13, and we're kind of going along here. 75 years down, nearly a century. It just doesn't look like we're going to make it. You know, we got the temple built, but, you know, the town is in ruins. Everything's in ruins. It's just not going to happen. And so that's how Nehemiah's story is presented here. That here's Nehemiah, and here's a man that is, you know, just in such a pronounced place. One of the questions that I thought was interesting is that, do you think the report that Jerusalem's walls were broken and the gates burned with fire referred to the Babylonian destruction of the city? Now, let's remind ourselves, 400 years before, back in 586, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the guy we read about in the book of Daniel, showed up and he destroyed the city, destroyed the walls, burned everything down, destroyed the temple. And I thought this was an interesting question because, you know, when I first read it, I just kind of thought, oh, yeah, sure. But then the writer kind of, you know, the question put out some other thoughts there. What were they? What else could have been the issue of the destruction here? George?
When the people of the land wrote letters to Artaxerxes,
Yeah.
and he replied, he gave them basically an order to stop the building.
And it says, what did they do? They took what to do it?
Force.
Yes, it says they went to do it by force there in verse 23. And I hadn't really not thought about that before. But we might be talking about the fact that, we're not just saying, yeah, the walls have been, that all this is burned down. They might be just saying, yeah, just last month, last year, last couple of years, the gate we had up got burned down and, we're not being able to build anything else. So that's interesting. Jordan, go ahead.
I am reading back when the Babylonians destroyed the temple. It never said that they burned the gate.
Oh,
It
interesting.
said they burned all the houses and then broke down the walls.
I remember them breaking down the wall. You're right, George. I don't recall a conversation about the gate being broken
They
down.
might have. It's just
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting point. So the time of Nehemiah, I had a picture here, and I hope it shows up. This is a nice screen to show up on of what the city of Jerusalem might have looked like in this time. Now, what's kind of neat here is that you see all this area up here. This is effectively wasteland. Back in the time, I'm going to jump back. Back in the time of King Hezekiah, do you see that most of Jerusalem was up here, was spread out there? But now, let's jump ahead again. There you got the nice Solomon's Temple up there at the top. But now, here in this time, that's all desolate. And it kind of struck me. It'd be like, if you went back to, I don't know, Portland or, some town, and all that was really left was the main street. And everything outside of that was destroyed. That's what it's like. You're living in a town where all the buildings are burned down, and you've got, and these walls, by the way, reflect the walls that Nehemiah will build, not the ones that are there. But you're just looking around, and you're living in a place that's just destroyed. It's kind of interesting. Have you ever heard the idea of broken windows and crime? The idea is that whenever you have a city where people don't fix broken windows or graffiti, the crime kind of compounds and grows itself. And I think about the idea that if you lived in a city that was torn down, would you just feel a lot of ambition to fix things up? If you lived on a block where all your neighbors don't mow their lawn and their roofs are collapsing, and wouldn't you just kind of lose the ambition to do it too? And I think that that's some of what's going on here. Is that there's a sense of an absence of an ambition to change things. And I get it. I think all of us have to reflect the idea. This is something the preacher says a lot. The idea is that our attitudes are contagious. And if we have a bad attitude, what's the story about Israel? What was their bad attitude that cost them the promised land? One thing in particular. How many times do we have to be warned? Don't grumble in the New Testament. Don't complain. Don't grumble. Because it's contagious. And cities don't get rebuilt and walls don't get fixed when people complain. And so these ideas, these attitudes, these problems are certainly something that we would say are gathering a sense of, why bother? We're just a beaten people. So it's interesting that when Nehemiah gets this news, and the question is, how does he react to this? How does Nehemiah take this news? What happens? So Nehemiah gets this message from everybody. He's far away. It's not affecting him. We're going to talk in a minute. He's got a pretty good job where he's at. What does the news do to him, Stan?
We sat down and wept many days, and then of course fasted, and then his prayers God.
So he wept many days, right? This, like a knife to the heart, okay? This is kind of the thing where you found out something about somebody you cared very much about, that, oh yeah, they're, the family's in a horrible condition, they're living on the street, something. It was a knife to his heart. It devastates him. And he goes out and he starts praying to God. Nehemiah has some fantastic prayers. Nehemiah has some interesting prayers. There's a few prayers in Nehemiah that aren't like anything anywhere else. In fact, tonight we're going to briefly talk about one. And so Nehemiah starts praying, and he says, God, we start praying about the circumstances you're in, and he's asking God to hear. What's the very first thing he acknowledges? Our sin is our fault. Yeah. I told you before, that was Ezra's great prayer too. It was these leaders that stood up and didn't say, look, it's all these people's fault. The great leader says, no, it's mine too. So, in fact, that was some of the things to say, what are the good qualities of leadership here? One of the first ones is accepting responsibility. Is that Nehemiah, and like I said, you and I blame Nehemiah, no, we'd say Nehemiah is not part of the problem, but Nehemiah says, I am. I'm attached to the problem. I'm joined to the problem. He says, your servants, who I'm one of, he says, I confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. Now, by the way, there's some question. Somebody once said, well, maybe Nehemiah's lamenting the fact that he didn't go back to Jerusalem. Now, I'm going to suggest to you there might have been a good reason he didn't go back. We'll come back to that here in a moment. But certainly, Nehemiah is simply accepting the idea that with sin, he prepares and accepts the idea that he has some culpability in it too. Teresa, you?
In verse 8, I like that he acknowledges that they were scattered because they didn't do what God told them to do.
Yeah. You know what's interesting, Teresa, is that in verse 8 he says, you said, if we don't do it, you do this to us. But then he says, verse 9, you also said that maybe you would bring us back together if we would turn to you. So what's neat about this prayer, another thing I want to point out is that when we pray, one of the big ideas when we talk about prayer is we say you have to pray the will of God. That we make God's will our will. So when we're praying, we're supposed to be praying as, having changed our will so that we're asking that God's will is done. And Nehemiah is praying in a great way because he's asking for something that we know is God's will. How do we know it's God's will that they should be restored to this place? Nehemiah tells us. How do we know it's God's will? He said it. God told them this. How do you and I today pray in God's will? How do we know God's will? Yeah, we've got God's will. God's told us the things that he desires for us, the things that he's offering to give us, the things he's telling us we can ask him for. And so Nehemiah's prayer is reflecting one of the great ideas of prayer is that when you're praying, you're soliciting God for things that you know God has said you can have. And that's important to understand. What else you guys see? Does anybody have another thought here about the characteristics of prayer? Go ahead.
I don't have to fix that a little bit. We also see up in verse 2 when Hananiah comes to him, he asks about the Jews who escaped and survived the exile. And it seems like he puts a lot of stress on, the people who live back in Jerusalem are the people who are performing the will of God.
Yeah.
I think that's really important.
Yeah. We talked about that last time, right? That these were the people that seemed to have the most desire to do the things of God. I mentioned that last week. And so it really is interesting that again, he's not just petitioning God, just save Israel because I love Israel. He's saying, God, these people went back with a purpose for you. And that's what's going on. Now, what is it, Stan? Go ahead.
I guess you're going to come to it. But he also prayed that I might have success and favor with this man.
Yeah. What's this man? All right. So here's what's interesting. Is that Nehemiah, one of the questions are kind of driving our minds this way to say Nehemiah is praying also a plan of action. I remember years ago, a brother in Christ said to me, he said, faith without works is dead. But he said, you know what else? Prayer without works is dead. I thought, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, no, prayer without works is dead. He says, if you're petitioning God, but you're not prepared to do the things that you can do to that end, then that's ineffective. He says, if you're asking God to change somebody's heart and you're not willing to be a part of that, he says, that's not gonna, you're not gonna see effect with that. If you're asking God to provide for you and you're not willing to labor or to do things, he says, prayer without works is dead. Now here's what's interesting about Nehemiah. Nehemiah has a plan. And he slips it in here at the end when he says, let your servant prosper and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now, who's this man? Stan has told us who this man is. We're about to meet him because then he tacks on this a little bit. I kind of think it's, maybe the passage should have been broke right here because he tacks this a little bit on. I was the king's cupbearer. I was the king's cupbearer. Hey, here's a picture of not Nehemiah, but Nehemiah's predecessor, the cupbearer before him. It was carved up in Persia, and it reflects the cupbearer for the Persian king. Either Xerxes or Artaxerxes, either his father or him. So this is one of his predecessors, but it's kind of neat to see an ancient picture, so to speak, of somebody we're talking about here. I was the king's cupbearer. When I was a boy, I remember cupbearer. I think, oh, cupbearer, Mama always said I got to take my cups to the kitchen. That doesn't sound too exciting. What was a cupbearer?
Was the one that had poison to the cup.
But it's funny. Yeah, you got it backwards. I read a funny story today about a Persian king who said, I'm going to execute my cupbearer. Told him, but he says, today's a holiday, so I'll do it tomorrow. So that night, the cupbearer poisoned him. But he said, you still got to keep working. I thought, well, bad idea. Don't tell someone. So number one, he's the man that's in charge of, how does he prevent poison getting in the cup? Yeah, he doesn't prevent it. He tastes it. He tastes it. So one of the big things we talk about is he tastes it. What else?
Well, he would have a relationship with the king,
How so?
pretty close relationship.
Yeah. Something as I was doing some reading on this, and I copied one of the things that I read about this, this position, and I didn't even appreciate this position actually has an honorific, meaning it's a title position. It's like being the Lord of something, or the magic. It was a title that you held in such a way that it had a great degree of prominence. A cupbearer, historically, an officer of high rank in the court whose duty was to pour and serve the drinks at the table. Now, first you think, in fact, King James sometimes is translated as a butler. By the way, though, even a butler has more of a prominence than sometimes we appreciate. But the idea is that this is a person who must have been regarded as utterly trustworthy, right? Utterly trustworthy. And I mean trustworthy to a degree that nothing, you had to have the kind of confidence in him that nobody could change his mind. He would guard against poison in the king's cup, sometimes required to swallow some of the drink before serving it. Now this is the biggest one perhaps. His confidential relationship with the king often gave him a position of great influence. Teresa was hinting at that. Go ahead, Teresa. You're gonna.
I was thinking about Joseph, and was it the cupbearer that he asked him to remember him when he
Yes, the baker and the cupbearer. Yes, and again, it's a position of prominence. What did the cupbearer do?
He told him about Joseph
Yeah.
and how he had, interpreted dreams.
He's the one that bound Joseph for Pharaoh. So it's interesting of that prominence. So the idea is that the cupbearer is with the king all the time. So he's always, he's allowed to talk to the king. Now, by the way, something really wild that's kind of important. Who else is he allowed to talk to? So I'll talk to him in chapter 2. And this one's kind of crazy, but he's also allowed to talk to the queen. Yeah. Natasha?
The queen.
Queen, yeah. So the queen. Now, that actually infers something really important that history tells us is true. You want to guess what it is? The cupbearer was traditionally a eunuch. So I said a second ago that there might be a reason Nehemiah didn't go back. Nehemiah may not have gone back because as a eunuch, what is he prevented from doing? He can't go to the temple. A eunuch is prohibited going to the temple. Now, by the way, you're kind of thinking of some of the famous eunuchs in the Bible. Our most famous eunuch in the Bible, the Ethiopian eunuch, had gone to Jerusalem. But I want you to think about that. He'd gone to Jerusalem to not go to the temple. But he went there to get as close as he could. I get goosebumps thinking about that guy. Because here's a guy that is denied access to the temple, but he makes a 1,000-mile journey to get there anyway. Well, I know why God wanted him to hear the gospel. Why they even got an angel to get the preacher to him so they could do it.
As a cupbearer, it isn't just when they have dinner, is it? They didn't drink water.
Right.
So they drank a lot of very weak wine.
Right.
Olive wine. And so whenever the king was thirsty, which would be all day long, this cupbearer would have to be with the king all day long, every day.
They said, one person said, this might be the most influential person there is because, as you said, he's with the king all day long.
Right.
So it was interesting. Like I said again, thinking, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, Nehemiah is one of the most important people in the Persian Empire to have that kind of relationship.
Well, it seems like also, it's the kind of person that the king has, well, like I said, it's a personal relationship to that. Something comes up, he seems like he might ask for advice or
Yes.
do a lot.
You trust him. He's in that position because of his character. and somebody says something to you, what do you do? I mean, I ask, so I'm sitting next to somebody, something's crossing my mind. What do you think about this? Now, here's the other thing, by the way. People would oftentimes pay the cupbearer to say, hey, if you were kind of, Teresa mentioned about Joseph, hey, remember me. Hey, if the king says he's looking for somebody who can bring in lumber at low prices, you remember Bob's Lumber, and here's a $25 gift card for you to help you remember. So one of the things to say about the cupbearer is they were rich because people were always paying them to put, to give ideas to the king and such.
And because his position was so important, I think that's why the king asked him, well, how long are you going to be gone?
Yes, because he wants him back. Now that to me is really interesting to say. Nehemiah doesn't really get to go home in this journey, does he? He only gets to visit because he has to come back. Now I think that's, again, a testimony to this idea of him being a eunuch. Something I hadn't thought of, I was reading one commentator, he said, notice all the times that Nehemiah said, God, remember me. And he said, here's the eunuch who has no children, no descendants to be remembered. And so Nehemiah's hope is that it's God that remembers him. Never thought about it. We're going to see one more instance, by the way, in a couple of weeks, where they're going to try to trick Nehemiah into hiding in the temple. And Nehemiah says, I've never sinned like that. And it only makes sense in the context of this conversation. So Nehemiah, like I said, there's a good reason why he might, or at least there's a good potential reason why he's not gone back. Because it's not really his to do now. He here has a very unique position as it is. And so, we're getting ourselves up to chapter 2. Actually, that's one more thing. A couple of questions here I thought were kind of interesting. And I love a question like this because this is a preacher question. When it's a think about the different things. What are the dangers of this position? Why is this position maybe not always the best of jobs to have had? I mean, for a spiritual person. Stephen? Jim? Oh.
I think two things. One, the king is worldly.
Yes.
Right? So to have that influence constantly, to have that around you. But two, how can you stay sober-minded if you're constantly drinking?
And you're required to drink. Yeah. And that's so interesting. I'd never thought of it until I saw the question. That here's a man whose job is to drink. Now, it was kind of mentioned they probably watered a lot of this down, but, maybe sometimes they didn't, So that really is interesting. Now, let's go back to your first comment, because I think that one is the one that maybe resonates a little better. You're being exposed to just an immeasurable amount of worldliness, of worldly people. Because here you have a carnal king, and even we can appreciate it because our leaders are restricted to some degree. Our leaders are restricted. But a monarch in that time, he could do anything he wants. That's about the most dangerous worldly position to be in, to say you could have anything you wanted. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life, it's all yours. You only restrain yourself, and there's no restraint there. Just think about the opportunities for worldliness in that situation.
Yeah, if the king could do that, Nehemiah probably had access to those.
Yes. He at least had it, and he would be exposed to it, in whatever fashion there is. Now, like I told you before, Brian loves the Persians. And one of the things I love about the Persians is that they don't have the reputation that the Greeks and the Romans and the Assyrians had. They didn't have that same kind of reputation. Remember Belshazzar in his feast and, getting drunk off the temple ornaments, and God gets so angry that he writes on the wall, you're a dead man. He doesn't write that, but I mean, effectively, you're a dead man, this is it. So the point is that these, the decadence of these kings, maybe the Persians weren't as bad, but even so, it's something to think about.
I was thinking of Daniel, he would not eat that food.
Yeah.
If it was offered to him. One of the chosen ones, and you gotta eat this food, and it's, I said, no.
Stan, let's talk about that a second. That's a good comment. I hadn't thought about that. So Stan's reminding us of Daniel 1, that Daniel was told, and I love the King James when it says the king's dainties, because in my mind, as a boy, all I could see was a table full of cream puffs, but what might it have actually been that he was being offered?
I mean, whatever he wanted. basically.
Whatever he wanted. One thought is, he kind of talks about the idea of it being a sin, so what might it have been? Yeah, unclean foods. Yeah, might have been a big part of that. So it's very interesting that he restrains himself like that. So that's an interesting observation.
Seeing we already should share that the king isn't going to let him stay in Jerusalem. This is a position where you belong to the king.
Yeah.
And even,
Yeah.
I think it even suggests, it kind of suggests in chapter 2 that even while he's mourning and fasting, he has to get up and go serve the king and kind of break that in the middle. When he says he had not shown the king has been sad in his presence.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of interesting. Let's go ahead and grab this for a second. Grant, do you mind reading maybe up through verse 3?
In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?"
First of all, kind of a little plug here. It's kind of interesting. At first we're thinking, well, is it like the next day? But actually, what are we being told about the timing here? We get a little bit of the time there in chapter 1, verse 1. Now in chapter 2, what? Yeah, this is months late that this topic goes. So it's kind of interesting to me to think about the idea that Nehemiah is praying for, what does he say again? To grant mercy to the king, that the king will give him mercy. But it's not as though he's walking in to see the king. We might think of this as a prayer for the opportune moment. So walks in, and what's wrong? What happens? This is kind of a strange story. What happened here? Nehemiah comes in and he's got that Charlie Brown countenance, got his head hung low. There's something about him that's completely different. Now, this has always interested me. Verse 2, the king says, "What's going on? Why is your face sad? What? You're not sick? It's a sorrow of the heart?" And he gets afraid. Why did he get afraid? What do you think, Tacho?
Maybe he thought he was poisoned?
Yes, I think that's a great answer. And that's what I think it is. In fact, I think it's the idea of the king saying, "Nothing wrong with you, is there?" Pouring out his cup. And he says, "Hey." I think that might be a big part of it. What else do you think? That's actually the one I think is the best part, but I think there's other things too, Steve.
Well, even if he's not sick, the king says this is of sadness of heart. This is nothing but sadness of heart. And that's going to be really concerning because this is the guy who's trying to keep the king alive.
Yeah.
And there's something wrong with him. And so I think the king is really concerned about, all right, is there something going on that I need to know about?
Yeah. Because you're and here's the thing. Maybe I think Artaxerxes likes Nehemiah, but he's still the king. He's still the guy in charge, and Nehemiah is still an instrument that, hey, did this thing just break? That might be a consideration.
I wonder if maybe there's some kind of, social or maybe even a requirement that you not.
That's the other thing that has struck me is what if this is because, and this is the thing that you kind of wish, well, I wish I knew a little more about their courts. The courts have funny rules like you can't break a rule that you make, right? There were lots of rules like, you can't make eye contact with the queen, or you can't, there was lots of things, and one of them could well have been, you don't show up unhappy in front of the king, you don't let your problems get known to the king. That's actually a pretty common thing even today, where they say, hey, when you're around this person, you don't let your problems show up. You act happy,
Especially when he says he had not been acting this way. Right?
Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it? That this was something new. Teresa.
So then he tells him what's bothering him, and then the king asks him a question, and he has to say a prayer.
Okay, let's read that. So this is the prayer that I said is so unusual, and it's only Nehemiah. So verse 4, Teresa's got us in verse 4. The king said to me, "What do you request?" What's interesting is Nehemiah just kind of explodes, I think. I don't know, maybe he doesn't explode, but he says, well, of course I'm sad. My home, the house of my father's in ruins. And the king doesn't say, keep it to yourself, the king said, well, what do you want? And what did he do?
Pray.
He prayed. What kind of prayer do you think that was, Teresa?
Probably like, please help me.
Yes. Here's why I think it's such a neat prayer. is that it's literally a prayer within seconds of, what do you want? Here's what I want. We all have prayers like that. At least I hope. Prayers that are just in the moment of, please don't let this be, or help me to know what to say. I've been times where somebody's asked me something, and my mom's saying, help me know what to say, and I got to start. There really isn't a prayer like this in the scriptures where you have the split second of prayer before you have to launch into the big thing that you've already hopefully been praying about. We look at what Nehemiah has done. He's already prayed about this, but now he comes back again in that split second prayer. Stephen.
We're not told this, but I get the impression this could be a silent prayer. And that basically, in a sense, could tell us that even if we're praying silent.
Yeah.
Still,
Stephen, what's interesting about what you're saying is that sometimes arises the question about the nature of prayer. Is prayer, silent? By the way, what other prayer in the Bible do we have that's silent? That you could say is certain for sure. She was asking for a child. Hannah. But really, there's not many prayers that we can actually say this had to have been a silent prayer. But Stephen, I would agree with you. I would say maybe it's not a necessary inference, but it's an inference, a heavy inference, that this would be a silent prayer. Especially since it seems to come right in there with him having that conversation. So I think you're exactly right. And I think it's nice to have these little tidbits. All of us think about prayer being silent. A lot of us even kind of think that's, pretty typical. We need to know that we have authority. This is a great passage for that kind of idea.
How often do not all of us do something similar as we're walking into that doctor's office?
Yes.
Please, Lord, be with me. But
Yes.
she's all, so you're walking into traffic court. Please, Lord.
Yes.
Me from this judge.
Yes. And what's great about that, Al, is that it's telling us that you can be effective in prayer without a great deal of, applied thought. But I will say the important idea is that Nehemiah has, number one, been a godly man, and number two, he's already kind of prayed about this. So it's already kind of a preloaded thing that he's already brought to God. But it says that prayer can be so very effective. I always think of the guy with the parable of the two men praying, and the one, the Pharisee, I'm so glad, I'm not like this guy, and he has this eloquent prayer, and the other guy says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner, 5 words, and, he's just, then Jesus says, that's the guy that was justified. That's a weighty thing.
Well, that's what you said. You talked about the several months since you heard of this problem, and you've been praying, but I think this, it's one thing to pray about something, and then spur of the moment, what are you doing, Stan? You gotta talk on the spot.
Yeah. So what does he have to say? Good.
Yeah.
Okay, here's my plan. Again, this is what makes Nehemiah such a great person to talk. Here's my plan. I'd love to talk at length, we don't have time, about the importance of spiritual planning. The idea that, we don't just walk our spiritual walk haphazardly. We need to plan. We need to think about goals. We need to think about, objectives. And we need to say things like, well, is this something I can do? Or what will I need to do this? Or how will I need to engage this? That is such an important thing for us to be thinking about. We don't think about it a lot. But Nehemiah is a great guy for setting this up. We can even add to this and say, one of the great things about Nehemiah is he prayed, but what else did he do when he prayed? Well, he planned. Fasted and prayed. Yeah. But planned is actually a big part of this too. But in his prayers, he was fasting and praying. So let's understand the importance that tying fasting to prayer is, and put this point to say, here's Nehemiah, planning, praying, fasting, setting it up. The moment comes, and he goes forward. Like Stan said, he steps up and he says, okay, here's my plan. Here's the plan, he says. The plan is, if it pleases the king and your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. So, here he presents his request. Let me go. Now, that's pretty bold because what have we said about the cupbearer? Every day, one of the closest confidants, you're there all the time, and he's saying, let me out of here. You go away. Let's talk for a second about the characteristic of this request. What is it that he wants to do? What do you think?
He wants to go there and rectify the problem.
Yeah.
Build the walls back up, get the gates back up, and all in a certain period of time. And I thought it was interesting. I didn't think he's gonna have time to get done, but he got done in 55 days. That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's right. Now that's interesting. And by the way, Stan, when we come to that point, we might say something like, that's why spiritual planning is important. That's why delegation is important. That's why, good leadership.
And I like the way that when he gets there, he picks each of the different groups. You do this, you do this.
Yes.
Yeah. We're not gonna look at this mountain of a thing, fix the wall. No,
Yeah.
you fix the one between the water gate, you fix the one by the dove gate, et cetera, et cetera.
What's interesting about that, and we're going to talk about this next week, but who's our leader in the Bible that somebody else had to tell him, you need to delegate? Moses. Yes. Moses' father says, you need to be delegating this. You need to find these guys that are going to take care of this because this is not working. And that's a fascinating consideration. Nehemiah, again, let Brian say one last thing about the Persians tonight. Fantastic about their organizational system. And so he's probably been in a place where he's been watching some of the best organized people there are running an empire. And so maybe some of that is sunk in. And he sees things like, you need to really, delegate if you want to accomplish tasks. And you need to, empower people to accomplish things if you want them to do things. All of these might be ideas that are sinking in with Nehemiah's mind. Anybody else have thought about his request? So like I said, he wants to save the city. Now, something kind of interesting I hadn't thought about, but the question brought this to mind. It said, did the king's granting Nehemiah's request show a shift in Persian policy? At first I thought, what are you asking here? So I went back and looked over the passages. What had happened just recently? And I forgot, because it was way back and early in Ezra chapter 4, that we read about this. Remember, we said Ezra's not chronological, and that makes it hard to track sometimes. But this was something that had happened, and in the passage we're reading, it was probably just a few years before. Maybe Nehemiah knew about it. I don't know. But what had just happened? What had King Artaxerxes done in the past? What did he order specifically? Right. So, yes, he had just recently ordered them to stop building by force. Now, this is kind of a tricky thing here. Because what have we said about the Persians and their laws?
Once it's made, it's made.
Once it's made, you can't change it. So what's going on here? Stephen?
Well, if you look at verse 21 in Ezra 4, the king is saying that this city may not be rebuilt until a decree is issued by me. So he may be reversing himself in the decree.
So what's great about what Artaxerxes said is he didn't give a in perpetuity statement. He simply said, and by the way, remember why Artaxerxes said, yeah, we better stop this?
Look at all the kings that have.
Yeah, he said, let's look at their history. Look at this Jerusalem. Yeah, we better stop this, But what's interesting about what Stephen said, and remember I told you Artaxerxes might be one of my favorites, that he says, let's stop it for now. Let's stop it for now. And so what's interesting is Stephen makes a great point to say, perhaps what we're seeing here is the idea that Artaxerxes was wise enough not to just throw everything out, but instead, let's wait. But what's interesting is that now that Nehemiah said this, the king's going to turn around and say, oh, right.
Makes you wonder how recently that was to Nehemiah, if Nehemiah might have been present for that, or
Yeah.
maybe Nehemiah asked it, put that.
Oh, yeah, I didn't think of that. Oh, wow, that's interesting. What if Nehemiah was responsible? I never thought about that. I kind of wondered, what if Artaxerxes says, hey, Nehemiah, tell me the story at Jerusalem. What kind of things? Well, if I'm going to be honest with you, maybe we're not always the most, that would have been a tough one to answer if I'd have been Nehemiah and Artaxerxes had asked.
I thought it's interesting when these people told the king they shouldn't be doing that. and they did a thorough search. Remember, they went with the castle, they went with the libraries, and, you know, it's easy to say, I didn't see anything wrong with that.
Yeah.
How much did you search to find out?
And you remember, like, whenever they were looking for Darius's decree, or Darius was looking for the decree of Cyrus, and they were searching all over the place. Now, one of the things is that just shows me people that were serious about records and serious about the rule of law.
And wanted to find out what was really right.
Yeah,
What was
yeah.
really said.
You know, one of the things about the Persians that's really neat about the Persians, okay, I said it last one more, is the Persians had a philosophy that truth was the ultimate ideal. And so one of the reasons that you can see them going out and saying, hey, what's it really say? They had what we would call in the New Testament the Berean spirit. That they said, what's it really say? That they love truth. You know what is interesting? The Persian word for truth is arta. So kind of an interesting thing that we grabbed there. So king says, you know, it's interesting when he says this, the king doesn't say yes. What's the king say? How long is this going to take? Okay, well, you know, it's only been 75 years since we started. I don't think he said 55 days. Stan's giving us a spoiler. What we're looking ahead to see that he's going to do. What's that?
In chapter 6 or 15.
Yeah, but
He didn't tell you. He didn't.
no, right. I'm just saying that it's really something to say. Well, you know, what do I say? How do I answer this? You know, and so you know, he says, I set him a time. I think it might have been about 10 years. You know, not that he said it's going to take me 10 years to build it, but he's going to be there for 10 years. We're going to get a sense of that because then he's going to go back and he's going to come back one more time. And it's about 10 years will pass in that time period. So maybe when it says he set a time, it might fit better to a little further on, chapter 13, verse 6, that it's going to be a 10-year.
Yeah, we talked about that, it being some time since the beginning of chapter 1. I get to think that this is something Nehemiah has been planning out, that he is, he's put together a plan of what he wants to do and how long he thinks.
Yeah, it's kind of like, let me just show you what I got written down here. You know, it might have been something that sophisticated to say, well, here's my plan. But he needs a lot of stuff, right? He starts saying, okay, but I need you to what? You need to give me permission. You need to give me some letters, authority. It doesn't specifically say it, but what position is he going to give Nehemiah? He's going to make him governor. Zerubbabel's old position, by the way. That's kind of interesting. So he's going to make him the governor of this province, and that gives him a lot of authority. And then he said, well, but if it pleases the king, give me letters for all these things. Give me, you know, the letters are going to give me access to all the, you know, the timber and the rebuilding things. He's kind of smart because he's saying, you give me permission to rebuild the citadel, you know, the walls, because that's what everybody's going to complain about. We already know that. Now, maybe one other thing it doesn't mention here, but we're going to come to it later. What else is he going to get from the king there in verse 9? I didn't read this, but.
An escort?
An escort. He's going to get a small army to go with him. Kind of neat how we'll contrast that with Ezra. We've come up to our time. Anybody have any final thoughts? Teresa?
I was just thinking that because the king knew him so well,